On a clear, sunny Sunday afternoon in May 1944, Pearl Harbor once again erupted into fire, chaos, and destruction, only this time it wasn't from an enemy attack. Instead, an accident inside the West Loch of the harbor would lead to the second greatest loss of life witnessed on Hawaiian shores during the Second World War. For far too long, the events of May 21, 1944, were shrouded in secrecy, and little has been spoken about the tragedy that unfolded on that Sunday afternoon. I did a short video some time ago about this incident, but I feel a longer video is warranted to adequately honor the servicemen who perished that day and completely tell the story of how this event unfolded, why it happened, and what came of the destruction that day. Let's start out with the geography of Pearl Harbor. It has 3 sub-areas: the East and Middle Lochs, which were the site of the infamous December 7, 1941 attack, and were the locations of the Navy's major installations and berthing for warships. Ford Island sits in the center, sort of in between the East and Middle Lochs. West Loch is separate from them and has its own channel and is not as well known to most as the other two are. During the Second World War, it harbored wartime logistics, such as ammunition, gasoline, spare parts, and general supplies. On May 21st, the West Loch was a hotbed of activity, as preparations for Operation Forager, or the conquest of the Mariana Islands, were almost complete, and the fleet was preparing to get underway for the invasion of Saipan on June 15th. In the loch that day were over 100 ships, including 29 combat-loaded LSTs and various smaller vessels that were shuttling ammunition and cargo around. An LST, which is short for landing ship, tank, is a vessel designed to support amphibious operations by carrying tanks, vehicles, cargo, and troops directly onto a beach without the need for a dock or pier. They were a little longer than a football field, had a crew of 119 men, and carried about 200 Marines into battle. Their magazines were loaded, and their ready ammunition boxes were full. 6,000 cubic feet of ammunition was stowed inside their hulls. The trucks, jeeps, and weapons carriers on the main decks were loaded with ammunition and fuel. Each LST also carried 80 to 100 drums containing 55 gallons of high-octane gas, as well as nearly 200,000 gallons of diesel fuel. Historian Howard E. Schuman noted, "To say that the LSTs were combat-loaded is a euphemism. They were floating ammunition dumps, floating gasoline storage tanks, floating vehicle garages, floating ship repair yards, and floating overcrowded hotels." Sunday, May 21st, 1944 was just another pristine day in paradise, until 3:08 that afternoon, when a sudden and catastrophic explosion rocked the forward decks of LST 353. According to witnesses, the ship appeared to just spontaneously combust. Shrapnel shot out in all directions, and burning debris fell from the sky, showering other nearby LSTs with white-hot fragments, which in turn started more fires. Flames and clouds of thick, heavy black smoke rose towards the sky. LST 179, which was tied up along LST 353, was on fire from her bow to her aft deckhouse in a matter of minutes. The fires that broke out on the ships tied up alongside LST 353 got out of hand so quickly, particularly on their forward decks where the gas drums were stored, that their crews couldn't get far enough forward to cast off and get their ships out of danger. Over at the next berthing area, LSTs tried to flee the maelstrom, either by their own power or with the assistance of tugs. Some tried to get to a far corner of the loch, while others made for open sea. None of them had made it very far when a second, much larger explosion rocked the loch a mere 3 minutes after the first. This explosion was caused by the gas drums blowing up on one of the ships at berth T8. Burning fragments now rained down throughout West Loch as the harbor surface began to catch fire from gasoline that had made its way into the water. Soldiers and Marines on the burning ships were ordered to get out of the way as the ship's crews attempted unsuccessfully to stop the fires. Some men were blown overboard by the blasts, or jumped to save themselves, while others were forced by the forward fires to the fantails where they jumped to safety. Many of them were subsequently picked up by small boats from other vessels, or swam for shore. But most of the LST passengers attempted to cross to the inboard ships to get ashore, and this caused so much crowding and confusion that crews on those ships were actually prevented from fighting fires on their decks. Finally, at 3:22, the third and most extreme explosion of them all erupted and showered flaming debris over a 3,000-foot radius within the loch. It was heard more than 15 miles away and created a massive mushroom cloud. This explosion was caused either by the ammunition cooking off on an LCT, which was tied down to the deck of LST-353, or the ammunition stored on one of the 3 outboard LSTs at berth T8. No one honestly knows. By this time, all 5 of the outboard ships had been given the order to abandon ship. The 3 inboard ships, although fighting serious fires, were not in a critical condition yet. Each one was able to get underway or was towed to safety nearby. But, by undertaking this action, the 5 outboard ships were now adrift and making their way towards berths T9, T10, and the Naval Ammunition Depot, where the cargo ship Joseph B. Francis was unloading 350 tons of ammunition. As the third explosion rocked West Loch, firefighting vessels were beginning to depart the Navy base at East Loch and from Honolulu Harbor. Tugboats and the few fireboats that were in the loch were trying desperately to tow the ships apart and douse the flames, but were very much outgunned in their efforts. Just before 5 that afternoon, LST-353, abandoned and adrift, finally sank in about 30 feet of water with a portion of her forecastle sticking out. LST-43 attempted to get underway, but was hampered when her lines failed to let go. Her situation was hopeless after the third explosion, and the abandoned ship order was passed. Similar situations existed aboard LSTs 69 and 179. The 3 abandoned and burning ships drifted together almost 600 yards, and their fires began to threaten the Joseph B. Francis and the Naval Ammunition Depot. Fortunately, one of the 3 LSTs sank a few hundred yards off the middle berth at the Ammunition Depot wharf. This brought the good fortune of anchoring the other 2 ships in place, which then also sank, thus keeping an even more catastrophic event from happening had they reached the depot. In fact, the danger that these 3 drifting ships presented was so great that at 4:30, 3 PT boats were dispatched to torpedo them before they could reach the ammo depot. The PT boats were ordered to stand down about 10 minutes later, as it became apparent that torpedoing them might do more harm than good to the situation. LST-480 was the inboard ship at T9. She tried to get underway but was blocked from doing so by the ships around her. The 3 drifting LSTs got pretty close to her, and the flames and heat from the 3 burning ships ignited fires forward of her bridge. She was grounded, before being blown apart by a violent explosion and sank near berth T10. Then, just after 7:30, a violent explosion on board LST-39 blew her bridge over the starboard side, damaging a tugboat in the process. Later, her stern and port side were rocked by another great explosion. She was then towed down the channel where she was beached near the ferry slip, and she burned for several more hours before her fires were finally brought under control. Explosions continued for hours, with several of the ships reigniting later that night. By 8 o'clock the next morning, all of the fires were either out or contained, and the U.S. Navy began to take stock of what had happened. With about 2/3 of personnel on shore leave when the initial explosion occurred, the death toll was nonetheless staggering. Samuel Eliot Morrison, historian of naval operations during World War II, concluded from his research that the death toll was 163 men. Another 396 sustained injuries. These numbers have been disputed over time, with the number of dead now believed to be 392. The scattering of ships during the incident and the departure for the Marianas a few days later hampered casualty counts at the time. 6 LSTs, 3 LCTs, and 17 amphibious tractors were lost. Another 2 LSTs were so damaged they could not be used for the impending invasion of Saipan. Over 20 buildings were damaged, pieces of steel up to 3 tons were blown into the depot, and unexploded ammunition was found. Telephone cables and power lines were cut, and some roofs had holes that were as large as 3 feet in diameter from the falling debris. And in the end, there was no real consensus as to what caused the initial explosion at West Loch that day. The theory that the incident was the result of a Japanese submarine attack was quickly dismissed because of the presence of anti-submarine nets. But there were plenty of other risk factors. Men were seen smoking cigarettes near gasoline drums, and welding had been underway on the deck of LST-353 prior to the opening explosion. LST-353's executive officer, in his testimony before the Court of Inquiry, stated that Army dock workers were unloading mortar ammunition from a LCT 963 on the deck of his ship when the first explosion occurred, and that he believed they had received no training for the task and may have mishandled ordnance. 80 55-gallon drums of fuel were stacked just 15 feet from where they were working, and it is possible someone from that group may have accidentally dropped a mortar round. The court ultimately found that one of these two reasons was the most plausible explanation, but couldn't settle on which one, as all who might have been able to give that information were among those killed in the disaster. Admiral Nimitz agreed with the court's findings, but he disagreed with the recommendation to avoid nesting combat-loaded vessels, as he deemed it necessary under the conditions of war and the layout of the Navy base at Pearl Harbor. It was a calculated risk that must be accepted, he stated, and his boss, Admiral Ernest J. King, Chief of Naval Operations, agreed. In the days following this incident, the military ordered a press blackout. Survivors and eyewitnesses were forbidden from talking about what happened in the West Loch, and 4 days later, the Navy released a very short statement, merely acknowledging that an event had occurred, but no details were given. It was only after Operation Forager had concluded that a slightly fuller account was given to the press, but even that account was lean on many details. The Court of Inquiry's report, dated June 29, 1944, was classified top secret, and not declassified until January 1960, which also hampered the public's understanding of and interest in the events that unfolded on that May Day in 1944. When salvage operations commenced in the weeks following the disaster, it is now believed that the Navy inadvertently found the fifth Japanese midget submarine involved in the 1941 attack, but didn't realize it. The shallow West Loch had to be cleared so that wartime operations could continue, and they dumped all the recovered material about 3 miles south of the entrance to Pearl Harbor. 3 parts of a midget submarine were eventually discovered in the 1990s and early 2000s at the dump site, and it is now believed that this submarine had penetrated the harbor and attacked Battleship Row before escaping into West Loch and being scuttled by the 2-man crew. Lying on the bed of the loch, it was then salvaged along with the victims of the disaster in 1944 and dumped out at sea along with them. The disaster in the West Loch of Pearl Harbor on May 21, 1944, was one of the greatest non-combat disasters in the history of the United States military, and it is that much more tragic because it didn't have to happen. Carelessness, on the part of multiple parties, along with the inherent risks brought on by war, led to the second darkest day in the history of the naval base. While I obviously understand the overhead needed to prepare for major offensive operations in an all-out war, better training was needed, and rules that were in place, like no smoking on ships laden with gas and explosives, should have been enforced much more rigorously. It is amazing that 9 of the 29 LSTs that were scheduled to take part in the invasion of Saipan were lost and replaced as quickly as they were. The armada of 535 ships left Pearl Harbor only a day late, and the invasion took place on schedule. Once again, American industrial might had flexed its muscles and saved the day. Today, LST-480 is the only reminder of this incident, its rusting bow still sitting where it was beached on that day. A memorial to the disaster was unveiled in April 1995, and the gravestones of the unidentified victims laying in the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific were amended in the 2000s from reading simply Unknown to Unknown, West Loch Disaster, the 21st of May 1944. May they rest in peace with the thanks of a forever grateful nation. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content just like this.